Alrighty, good morning, everybody. So you should see Robert and Carrie on the screen, and they're here today to talk to you all about taxes.
How exciting. Right. Okay, well, hey, welcome to the KWB Studios live here in Redlands, California. So what we really wanted to do is kind of just dive into a few minutes of talking about some of the things that happened over the course of the last...
Or what didn't happen.
Or what didn't happen. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, because I think as we sat here in the primaries and hearing some of the things that were going on and proposed as far as maybe all the school student debt being forgiven, maybe universal health care for all, free tuition for the future, you kind of wondered, well, my goodness, how are we going to, pay for all that? And so we did hear a few suggestions back in the day. But then as we came into the primaries and it was Biden who actually won, as far as that, and then ultimately won the presidential nominee. What we did see that the blue wave that we kept hearing about really didn't materialize. In fact, in the House, I think the Democrats lost a few seats, but it is very, very close in the Senate as far as who's going to win, as far as maintaining control of
and
the
Wall
Senate.
Street likes that divided Congress with a Democratic president.
Right, for sure. And even under, when Biden was in the race, he was talking about the things that he was going to do. And I put this little drawing of a rifle, and basically you said, taxes are not going to go up for people, except unless you have a household of income of over about 400,000. So those people that made over 400,000 were in the crosshairs, but it appears because of the makeup of the Congress and the Senate and no clear majority, probably any major tax changes is going to be tough to implement.
And I think the wild extremes that Wall Street was worried about, I think Wall Street was very relieved with the results of the election.
Mm-hmm.
That probably had some influence on the market that we're seeing today.
Sure, because it's really been a great market.
Yeah.
And even though up to the election, President Trump had said, hey, if I don't get elected, be careful, be worrying, because you're going to see a great recession like you've never seen before.
Right.
So far that, hasn't materialized. So, what is happening in taxes and where are we headed? I know when I was sitting here, maybe back in the summer and listening to some of the proposals, I was certainly worried as far as some of the extreme things that I heard. I'm very relieved that those aren't likely to happen. But what kind of adjustments are we likely to see? And I want to start first, Rachel, if you'll pop up the slide with showing marginal rates. So one of the things that we did with the first slide here showing marginal rates is we're kind of looking at what has happened to taxes really over the last 40 years. We've seen all kinds of marginal brackets. We did a little quiz here at the beginning, and I hope we'll have the answer here soon. But what we showed was what kind of marginal brackets were in place during the last umpteen years. And if you look at the slide that we have in front of you now, you'll see going all the way back to 1975, the average marginal bracket was around 27.5. And then it kind of declined, and then it gradually rose, and it rose all the way up until about 1990. And if you remember, Clinton won after George Bush Sr., and Clinton did raise taxes. And in the late 1990s, it was interesting because that was one of the few times, Bob, I remember there for a little while where we talked about what are we going to do with all the surpluses?
Yes, exactly.
I think that conversation was with Clinton and Alan Greenspan.
Federal
and it
Reserve.
probably didn't last much more than a year or so,
No.
because then things changed.
They usually don't want to pay down the debt. They probably have some other ideas that has to do with the money.
But Rachel, let's go back to that slide because I wanted to just make one point there. And what you'll see in that slide over the last, 40 or so years is look at the marginal bracket of the highest quintile up at the top.
Which is that top line.
Right. And what you'll see is that bracket really hasn't changed much. People were paying 27 and then maybe up to, 28 and then maybe all the way down to 22. And we're kind of staying constant.
They've nuanced for the highest earners, but we don't see extremes like we saw maybe in the 40s and the 50s when it was 60, 70, and 80%.
Yeah, and actually, I'll give away the answer is the highest at like 94%, I think in 1914 or something like that. But what you look at the other brackets, the purple and the yellow and the red and the lighter blue or darker blue, what we're seeing is those people in the lower quintiles are generally paying less and less taxes as a percentage of their income.
So those that make less are paying less and less of the cost for running the government.
Right, absolutely. Yes. So I think, one of the things that we look at is, it's nice to pay less taxes. And I think we all want to pay the least amount that we possibly can. On the other hand, and I know we're going to talk about this tomorrow, I think it's, or Wednesday, I'm sorry, the deficit. But on one of the other hands, it's like, well, how do we keep doing all these things and still live within our means? So I think on the next chart, Rachel, if you'll bring that up.
But I don't think politicians worry about living within their means.
Well, it's because the problem will be gone, or it'll be there after they're gone.
Right. We'll let the other guy worry about that.
Yeah. So here's an interesting chart. Bob, you can explain it.
Well, it's the top line shows the effective rate of what you're really paying for taxes. These are federal taxes. And what you see is the blue line is the actual debt of the federal government. And so the average American, if you will, is paying somewhere between 25 and 30% of effective taxes. But what's interesting is, especially over the last couple of years, the amount of debt that the federal government has taken on in order to pay for all the services has really gone through the roof. The number I have is the federal government in 1990 owed $3 trillion worth of debt. In August of 2019, it had risen to 22 trillion in debt.
And I think we're at 27 trillion, and they're proposing by the end of the year or maybe next year, we'll be at 30 trillion.
And what's interesting, the revenue that the federal government earned in 2019 of 3 trillion we could have used all that to pay the entire debt off in 1990.
Yeah.
And so it's amazing. It's that's a lot of debt.
Yeah.
And at some point, somebody's going to have to start paying.
So I guess when you start thinking about taxes and planning your future and how do you do things, I think one of the things that I have done for me personally is I kind of say, you know what, I'd rather pay the devil I know than the one I don't. So for me, it's been, Roth conversions, paying taxes now so I don't have to pay them later. And I think also maybe even with capital gains, as far as, if you have gains in your portfolios and you're wondering, well, do I pay taxes now or, do I postpone them? And even though I would say that it appears the cap gains rate can't or isn't likely going to go up in the short run, because maybe they don't have the votes. In the long run, when you look at those deficits and you look at the tax rates, we're in a historically pretty low marginal brackets. I can't help but think that, boy, taxes will probably have to go up in the future.
Not only looking at what taxes you may want to take, whether it's now or whether it's later, but if you're making a lot of income and you got some extra cash, that's where maybe municipal bonds also come into play. It's not necessarily how much you make, it's what you're allowed to keep. Right,
yeah. And I think is our next slide has to do with California.
Yeah, and it's the California way of somebody has to pay for it.
Yeah,
and I think there's a similarity as to what we're seeing in the federal government taxes and who pays what, and also in California.
Right. So I think I heard a company that announced they were leaving California for Texas. What was that company?
Hewlett-Packard.
Yeah. And isn't there another CEO or two?
Elon Musk on Friday had mentioned that he's seriously considered personally of relocating out of the state.
Right.
Also to Texas.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is if you look at the chart that's on the screen today, what you'll see is all the way back to 1990. So those that are fortunate to live in, sunny California, or maybe those are so unfortunate to live here, in the highest marginal brackets, we have seen taxes go up about 65% for the highest marginal bracket people in the state of California just over the last 20 years. And the trend, I think even Gavin Newsom had proposed something earlier, kind of went hush hush. They even had a higher proposal for maybe even all the way up to 17%. But California, New York, and New Jersey is certainly one of the highest tax states in the nation. And I think the concern is you keep raising taxes, then what happens? Well, people go to Texas, people go to Florida, people go to Tennessee.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's not a revenue problem. California has a $200 billion budget. Last year, it was $195 billion. They're not running out of cash.
They're just spending on new programs and things like that.
It's a spending issue.
Right.
It's not a revenue issue.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you see some of even all the money that's been spent, some of the cities are still having a lot of problems, whether it's homelessness or, healthcare or all kinds of other issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's a politician can always think of ideas as to how to spend your money.
Right. Yeah, so we talked about these California rates. how does that relate maybe even to the corporate tax rates?
Well, corporate tax rates are around 21%. They're lower under Trump than they were prior. They usually are around 30%. But I always said to myself, like the individual states that compete against income taxes, countries compete against corporate tax rates as well.
Mhm.
And so under the Biden plan, one of the issues, if we're on crosshairs is, well, let's get the corporations to pay their fair share. Maybe 21% is too low. And so that at some point may be going up, probably not immediately.
Right.
But the politicians also have to worry, okay, if you raise the corporate tax rate in the US, that company could also relocate outside the US. You have to be competitive.
Sure. Go to another country that maybe is only charging 20.
Ireland has 0.
Right. But if they do raise taxes, Bob, who do you think really pays it? I mean, don't you think if I'm a company and I have to pay more taxes, what do you think I might do to the products and services I sell?
Yeah, maybe you'll raise the prices.
And
It's
then-
the consumer that pays for it.
Ultimately, it's
Yeah.
the consumer. So, be careful when you aim for one guy, sometimes you hit another guy.
Right.
And that reminds me back to the day when the luxury tax was out there. The luxury tax was a 10% tax, but on boats and high-end cars. Well, the rich guys quit just buying the boats and the high-end cars, and guess who worked at the boat yards? The people at the lower marginal bracket. So, there's always an unintended consequence. There's always some kind of a shrapnel that's going someplace else that's going to infect or implode someplace else.
And they usually don't think that out.
Right. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. Okay. What's the next slide?
Explain as to what this is, and it's interesting in that you have both taxes that are being paid and revenue that's being created. And so, but you also have the accumulation of federal debt, if you will. And so the red line shows, obviously, one of the ways that governments can raise taxes, raise revenue, if you will, is the charge on capital gains. When you make a profit, some of that profit is going to have to go back to the government, whether it's the state or the federal or both. And so historically, when you see capital gain rates go down, that's an incentive maybe for that individual to take that profit. And so the revenue back to both the states and to the federal government sometimes go up. Lower taxes, higher revenue. That's
Right.
the idea behind it anyway.
Yeah. And you look back and you look at the chart in the 70s, you had these high marginal brackets for capital gains. And you also, if you remember, we had stagflation and inflation. The economy really was doing poorly. Gradually, you lowered capital gains and you see a spike in revenue. I can't read that year
Yep.
there. Maybe it's in the early 80s or something of that nature. And then we raised taxes a little bit, and then we started lowering long-term cap gains again. And then that started creating actually more revenue because people were willing actually to then sell an asset that they had a good investment, made a good investment, and then ultimately reap those gains. And so you see that big spike here more recently, and maybe that's part of the Bush and the Trump and era again.
Right. So apparently the idea is if you lower tax rates, higher revenue occurs.
Right.
Well, it's interesting in that in some states like California, the thought may be, at least on the next slide, is it's called a Laffer curve, and I think it's a great chart. Horizontally, it shows as tax rates go up, at least initially, going perpendicular is the amount of revenue that's created. So as tax rates go up, at least initially, more revenue flows to the municipality or to the state. But at some point at the top is the trying to find the sweet spot. How high can you raise tax rates before that individual, like maybe Elon Musk, decide, I think I'll look at maybe relocating to someplace else.
Sure.
Or you start bartering, or as Sweden had 60% tax rates in the early 80s, people decided to go underground.
Like a private or a black market economy.
Correct.
Right. Hey, barter, pay me in cash, I won't report it, and things like that. So that's the $99 million question or whatever. It's like, hey, what is the highest marginal rates that we can charge to bring in the most amount of revenue? Because at some point, then you reach a point of diminishing return.
And people begin to flee, maybe
Yeah.
going to Texas or Florida.
Right. And I remember in the state of California, I had a thought and I just lost it, Bob.
That happens.
Yeah.
That happens.
Right. What was I going to say about California? But chime in if you've got some other thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years with this new administration as to how much they can get away with. But I think the fear initially of some massive changes to the tax system, I think that's off the table, at least at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's off the table too, because even if Biden maybe had the votes, the economy is still pretty fragile.
Yeah.
We're just talking now about maybe vaccines starting to flow, maybe even this week. We've heard in UK, I think it's tomorrow. But until this economy has maybe more stability and it's not so fragile. I mean, here in California, we're seeing another lockdown.
Yeah.
You know, the restaurants are closed. You know, the bars and getting a haircut and all kinds of things that are now being impacted again. So to go in and raise taxes when things are so fragile just doesn't make sense.
No, I mean, we're talking stimulus before
Yes.
we're talking tax
Right,
rates.
right. So maybe 2022, maybe 2023, depending, we might see more of that kind of a bipartisan agreement, because ultimately, how do you deal with the deficits?
Right, at some point.
Yeah. And so it goes back for me, it's like, you know, when you look at the marginal rates and you look at where we are, the trend does not appear to be your friend. It just seems that with the deficits, so if I had an opportunity to maybe pay capital gains this year or next year, I might be likely like, okay, maybe I better do it now because, you know, down the road, depending on the administration, we might see some increases. And ordinary income, you know, another thing is, yes, consider Roth conversions, things of that nature, depending on your marginal tax bracket, because then I have another saying, it's better to pay taxes on the seedling than the harvest, right?
Yeah.
You know, pay taxes on the 6,000 or 20,000 you can put away in your traditional, so that later down the road you get it out, you know, completely tax free.
And my thought is, if in order to, it's not what you make, it's what you keep.
Right.
I like municipal bonds.
Yes.
We always look at what is a good chance, what's a good opportunity these days. 2-year municipal bonds actually pay more than 2-year treasuries.
Right. In fact, we were on a call not that long ago where they were saying, hey, municipal bonds are really a great opportunity, especially revenue bonds, because they're not as impacted by GO bonds like, you know, state of California or a hospital. Or, hey, I promise to pay you, where revenue bonds are actually more directly being paid back by the revenue, like an airport or, you know, something of that nature.
Right.
Sure. So, Rachel, we've gone about 20 minutes or so. How about, do we have any questions in the audience that we want to start addressing?
Yeah, we have one question. I think you really just answered it, but they're wondering about, will capital gains affect individuals also, both long-term and short-term? And what will be good investment strategy for most individuals if this is the case?
Yeah. So I would just start with this. Today, I think you can make a total of, if you're a married household person, about 500,000 before you hit the 20% bracket. So, you know, for a lot of people, they're a long-term cap gain rate around 15%. Now, of course, state of California doesn't have a cap gain rate. It's all treated as ordinary income. So at 15%, and then I think if you're under 80,000 for a joint, you're no capital gains. Those are things to look at, because like I said,
You can keep 80% of your profits.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's not bad. Well, unless you're a California resident,
but
then
that's still pretty
that's
darn
not
good.
That's right, absolutely. So we think, you know, taking a good look at that, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know that a person has to do it this year. I think it's going to be a 1 or a 2 or 3 year gradually, where, you know, whether it's you know, both parties coming together and trying to, you know, deal in and grapple with the deficit, or if, you know, there is more of a blue wave in the midterms next time, you know, that possibly he could get the votes. But I don't see much change, certainly in
That initial fear, I think, is off the table
Yes,
for
right.
2021.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so Prop 19 passed in California. What does it mean for the state and how might it impact families?
So why don't you first explain Prop
Yeah.
19, because we've got some out-of-staters that might be living.
Yeah, if you're in
listening
California, you may be subject to a really low property tax. I always tell people the states typically have 3 areas as to how they raise revenue. It's property taxes, sales taxes, and then income taxes. And one of the things that California, obviously in the 1970s passed, was Prop 13, that you can keep your low base. And so prior to the passing of Prop 13 in this last election, the requirements to keep that low base is, if you wanted to downsize, you could only move once to keep your low base into a new home. That home had to be under $1 million, and it had to be less than what your current value of your house.
So you had to downsize, literally lower price.
Right. And if you decide to move in order to retain that, you have to move within your same county or 10 other reciprocal counties in order to be able to do that. Well, that's pretty restrictive. And so Prop 19 said, now you can move up to 3 times. You can buy any house that you want, and not necessarily it had to be less price than what you currently have. And better yet, if the kids inherit it, the kids, in order to be able to get that low base, frankly have to move into the house as primary residents 12 months after your death. If they decide, one of the things that came up is some of the kids would previously use that house as a rental. Well, that wasn't the original idea. And so it now has to be a primary residence. Right. But once again, it gives you some flexibility of moving up to 3 times. You can downsize or upsize if you want. But the restriction is, at least for the kids, is they've got to be able to use that as a primary residence.
And I think, we have another question I was going to add. I think what you're seeing there in Prop 19 is kind of like even what you saw in the IRAs. The IRA really was for the mom and the father. The mother and the father pass away, they give it to the child. It used to be the child could draw it out over their lifetime. It could be another 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And now the ruling is no. It was your parents' IRA, not yours. So now you have to take the money out within 10 years.
Right.
They want the revenue. So if you're not going to live in the house and you're not going to actually benefit as a resident, then no, you have to pay the tax.
Right.
The government wants to realize the revenue sooner,
Right.
Than later.
And it's interesting in that, as I said, we've seen clients move to other states.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people, okay, you may be moving to Texas and to Florida because you're trying to get away from the income taxes, but also check the property tax.
Right.
And
Maybe state and local taxes.
the state and local
Right.
taxes.
Yeah, because I know Florida has a lot higher property taxes
Yeah.
and they reassess you regularly.
So does Texas.
Yes, so it's not like, you come, all the taxes are
Right.
cheaper. All these states have to have a way of getting money.
Yeah, sales tax in the US or in California in particular is the general base is 7.25%. And then the localities can add up to 3%. That's actually the highest in
The union.
all 50 states.
Doesn't surprise me, Bob.
Me
Welcome
either.
to California.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We love the weather.
Do you think any of these tax changes will be effective for 2021 filing?
My personal opinion.
That was
is-
the fear.
Yeah, that was the fear. I think the only one that I could see possibly is maybe the corporate tax rate. I think all the other individual tax brackets and rates,
Sorry, guys, we're back.
I think all the individual tax rate changes probably off the table. I know we're going to have tomorrow estate planning. I kind of think that's off the table. I don't think you can get the votes. But, the corporate, if you're a politician, it's easy to sell. That would be the one that I could see. And most people probably aren't impacted by that one. That's my guess.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure it's a negotiating part with the Republicans. You can raise the corporate rate, but let's keep everything else the way it is.
Right. And maybe it's a deal thing. You know what? We'll let you raise the corporate rate, but then your stimulus is only going to be $1 trillion instead of $3 trillion that the Democrats had wanted earlier on.
How do we pay for all this though?
Right. It goes back to, long term, the marginal brackets have been pretty low in this country. The question is, it's a little scary when you look out into the future.
And I get that fear from clients as to what's going to happen to the dollar, what's going to happen to the economy when somebody starts paying all this back. I don't think it's a problem over the next few years, 10 to 20 years down the road. At some point, you got to pay the piper.
Well, and that goes, someone else is going to use that saying. It's like, I think Winston Churchill said something. Once Americans exhaust every other resource, they'll do the right thing.
Right.
And maybe at some point in time, we will do the right
It
thing.
takes us a while.
Right. Any other questions?
How about one last one and then we'll call it time. So, talking about the corporate, I guess you already
I think it was
really
the Social
just-
Security one.
Yeah. I currently receive Social Security. How might I be impacted?
Bob?
I think there was a fear prior to Biden that as you're working and you're paying into Social Security system up to a certain dollar or amount. In 2021, it's up to $142,000 that you pay into Social Security, and after that, you get to keep. You don't have to pay that tax. Maybe increasing that to some higher amount. And so, if you're making $200,000, $300,000, $500,000, you're going to constantly having to pay that tax in the Social Security. I think that was a fear. Also, not Social Security income is taxable. It's not 100% taxable. It's up to 85% taxable, but it goes back to, Bill Gates may be getting Social Security at this point, and he's only having to pay up to 85% of his income. Social Security income is taxable. Why didn't you use 100% of that Social Security as taxable income?
So we're talking about more means testing.
Yeah.
In other words, that's changing the code, which we don't think is likely. But if you are getting Social Security today and you're a recipient, we don't really see any changes on the taxation or the percentages down the road, now down the road, like I said, we look at all the entitlements and it falls, I don't mean to say that in a negative, the entitlements fall into Social Security and Medicare. But, long term, there seems to be an issue. And so we may see more means testing down the road, but that would be part of a broader tax package bill that we're talking about, down the road, and maybe, marginal rates go up, maybe cap gains go up, that's part of that all negotiation part.
But not over the next year or two.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So.
Well, we have one last question, and they're wondering about the Medicare income related monthly adjustment amount. They're wondering if that's going to be in consideration with the new tax rates.
We talking about Medicare Part B?
Yes. Part B or D.
Yeah, I have not seen anything on that area. Your Medicare Part B is based on your adjusted gross income for the prior 2 years, I believe.
Yeah.
Right. And so, again, that would have to be more on this negotiated tax plan changes that we just don't see happening anytime soon. I think at this point, the politicians want to get a handle on COVID. They want to get the vaccine and get it out. They want to stabilize the economy. And I think
stimulus and infrastructure, maybe.
Yeah. And let time maybe heal some wounds and we keep on going.
Yeah.
So I think in the near term, everybody, really no change to taxes, at least for the next, couple of years.
Okay. And so with that, I'm going to end our poll. And just so we'll answer these questions. So, would you be willing to pay more taxes if it went to paying the deficit? So 3 out of 24 people said yes, and 21 out of 24 said no.
Yeah, so that's, what's that, about 80%, 85% said no, thank you.
We'll let somebody else pay the deficit off.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then the last question, what do you think the highest marginal tax bracket has been in U.S. history? So it was 94%, and only 2 people got that incorrect.
Yeah.
So a lot of people assumed it was the one now.
Yeah. Yeah. And at 94%, if 94% of your revenue was going to not go to you, it's like, well, why not just stay in bed and, not make that extra?
I move someplace else.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Well, great. We hope you enjoyed today's, talk on taxes. Want to just remind you that Tuesday, we're doing the same thing with estate planning. You'll have different speakers. Wednesday, we're going to talk about the deficit in the room. And we kind of just hit on that slightly. Thursday, we're going to talk about some investment strategies under the Biden administration. In other words, what kind of companies or industries might do a little better based on some of the changes that Biden is wanting to take the country. And Friday is about good news. We're just going to talk about good things that are happening, some things that happen throughout the year, actually here at KWB and other places. And also for those that might want to remind others, if you enjoyed today's thing, we're going to have recordings available on our website no later than December the 18th. It's just more of about a legal issue that we have to get through. And all this rest of the week, the webinars start at 11 a.m. So Tuesday, estate planning. Wednesday is the deficit. Thursday, investment strategies, and Good News Friday. So have a great rest of your day. And if you're in California and you're in the LA County and San Joaquin Valley, I guess have fun at home.
There you go.
Yeah, right. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.